Hello, folks. This is August 28th, 2018. This is the standard SIG cluster lifecycle meeting. We have a pretty sparse agenda. I think the first item I wanted to discuss was a follow-up from last week that we want to make this call be more meta across the entire SIG. SIG cluster lifecycle is growing in the number of sub-projects it has. We want to make sure that we have a venue to clear out the meta topics. And we want to make sure that the sub-project leads have a location where they can address some of the issues that occur across these different sub-projects. That's like test automation, processing, release cycle stuff, because I'm sure as sub-projects grow and grow and grow, we're going to need some grand unified field theory for how we curate these artifacts together for any given release. So I sent off an email. We talked about it last week. I just want to make sure we touch on it today to see if there's any objections to the idea of moving this to a bi-weekly meeting with the intent of focusing on just that stuff.
So I don't have an objection about that. My concern was that we spend a lot of time for kubeadm in this meeting, and kubeadm needs a lot of work, and I think the office hours are most of the time not sufficient in time for that. Maybe before kubeadm GA, we need to spend more time on it, like allocate more time. I'm not sure how, because everybody is busy. So, I mean, like an hour and a half a week is probably better. But the question is how. I mean,
so I have, Jason, can you kind of moderate the conversation right now and kind of lead it? Because right now I have to go and do some emergency parenting stuff. Be right back.
Yep. So, Lubomir, I guess the question I have around that is the concern more about having this kind of forum to actually work through issues, or is there some things that we can better do kind of asynchronously? Is it blocked on decision making? You know, what's the blocker that you're mainly concerned about there?
So last week we made a private meeting about the config, and the config needs a lot of discussion. Mm-hmm. So we can potentially make such private meetings recorded, but it feels like the question here is, should we extend these office hours meetings to be longer, or it's probably okay to instead like make these private meetings about the config and not bother everybody?
Yeah, I think I like that idea. If we have a targeted issue that needs to be worked through, for us to spin off a specific meeting, and I do like the idea of recording those and posting those for external consumption as well.
So I guess it's okay to keep the office hours like the target for kubeadm, and allocate separately individual meetings that we should record and share.
Yep, I think that sounds good. Does anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns about that?
I mean, this is mostly a topic before we get the config being solid and before GA. And at that point, we can reduce the amount of these private meetings eventually. But the problem with the private meetings is that nobody has them in the calendar. And we have to chat a lot about these, like what is the best time for them. And people cannot attend. So that's part of the problem as well.
It sounds like you're concerned with a couple of issues pre-GA, and that seems like scheduling is difficult with those. It might be that those are just one-off meetings that we will have to deal with bad scheduling issues for a little bit before GA, but I'm not sure it warrants making the meetings longer, because sometimes those meetings are ineffective with large groups of people.
That's true.
So I kind of missed some of the meta topics. Does anybody keep notes here or no?
I don't see any notes. The gist of it, Tim, was the concern, especially around topics that relate to GA and are, quite involved, like the config changes that we have coming up, and not having enough time to address those within the current office hours time.
I think we can absolutely add some of those things to the meta topic of SIG cluster lifecycle in the biweekly meetings, because some of those things bleed over, right? Like the GA configuration changes for kubeadm totally will bleed over to folks who are using, kubeadm as the implementation choice for the backend for their cluster API implementations. So I think stuff like that kind of can bleed. But like,
sorry to interrupt you, Tim, but I think, I think we want to keep that like the topic there more high level. I think this was more about kind of in-depth technical discussions and things like that. And one of the things Lubomir said is we've done a couple of private meetings for these types of topics in the past. And I think we can get away with kind of spinning off those meetings as needed to kind of go into those topics more in depth. But we had discussed also publishing, the recordings of those meetings instead of leaving them private.
Yes, I do think we should publish those meetings because they have impact. I know, like the conversation that Chuck, Lubomir, myself, and Fabrizio had last week is germane to everyone who works on kubeadm, and probably should have recorded that and published that, because that basically spelled out what we plan to accomplish for the rest of the 112 cycle. So I do think that it's the responsibility of the leads to make sure that that information is recorded for broader dissemination.
So even if we don't have a fixed time for these private meetings that concern GA, do you guys think that it's a good idea to have an optional hour for these, like during the week or every couple of weeks or something like that?
I think you can do it ad hoc as needed, because like the one thing I don't want to do, what I'm kind of worried about with SIG cluster lifecycle right now, and the reason why I want to move this to biweekly is it's kind of becoming fractal with meetings. And there is a meeting for every provider. There is a meeting for the main cluster API meeting. There's also a meeting for there's two separate meetings for office hours. So it's kind of getting fractal, and it's kind of getting a little out of hand, in my opinion. And we kind of need a better process for dealing with issues across these different implementations, different cloud provider implementations. And we just want to make sure that we're respectful of people's time. I do think there will be instances where we probably should have some reserved slot and use it, but try to use it like as needed basis only, right?
So I guess we can keep these ad hoc, like optional meetings, but not a reserved calendar time for them.
Perhaps we could use the alternating week time slice for this thing as the.
Yeah, I guess the point is to get the config done because it needs a lot of discussion. That's like the primary concern. I mean, I know that everybody's busy with Cluster API, separate project, personal projects, but the concern here is to get the GA part of kubeadm.
No, I understand your concern. I agree. I think we can address it as needed, and I think we should try to be a little bit ruthless too with our agenda items. So if we need to, we'll break it out and definitely address it. But I also think, like, let's make sure that we get stuff on the radar, and we're constantly, as a SIG, making sure we're kind of ruthless with our time, so we can be gracious with people. That's kind of my motto, right? Be as ruthless as we can with our time, so that way, as our time, when we sync together, we can make sure we're on track and on point.
Yeah, sounds good. On Tuesday and Wednesday, I have meetings up until 1 a.m. in the morning, so I'm pretty ruthless with my time.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the problem, right? It's like I want to make sure that we're respectful of people's time in different time zones and everything else too, because I'm just generally concerned the meta problem of having too many meetings for SIG cluster lifecycle right now.
Yeah.
So I think we talked about that as part of the bi-weekly change. So are there any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns, or should we just go ahead and move to bi-weekly for this meta meeting to clear out that stuff?
Bi-weekly sounds good to me.
Sounds good.
All right. This doesn't have to be me talking about it. This can be anybody, but I wanted to start to like at least have the recording here so we can disseminate it for the broader SIG cluster lifecycle. And maybe I can share my screen and I want other people to talk about it too, about how we do grooming within SIG cluster lifecycle, because it's not uniform across the project of Kubernetes, but I would like it to be uniform across SIG cluster lifecycle because we are in many different repos. So that way, as we address issues and have a prioritized backlog, it's easier to federate responsibility and to have folks spin up who might not be part of this individual group but want to know more and want to get involved. I think the one thing that was really successful with this group is to have a way, have a means by which we can bring folks on board and for them to be able to see the backlog and to know what the backlog is and be able to contribute over time. And that's not consistent across other SIGs inside of Kubernetes. In case if you go to SIG networking and you try to understand their backlog, you are better than me. So why don't I share my screen here and I'll just record and we can talk about this thing openly, and I'll use it as a dissemination means to the broader cluster API folks. So let me first share my screen. I don't necessarily, here it is. All right, so let's go to the Kubernetes repository. One of the first things we do is we always make sure that the milestones are consistent. And we try to clear out the milestones. So I've cleared out the old milestones, so they no longer exist, right? And every cycle, I try to make sure that the milestones are up to date, and Chuck keeps me honest periodically and says, like, why are we maintaining these milestones? So currently for a given milestone like V112, I did a lot of work in the last couple of days to try and make sure that V112 is mostly representative of what we can try to accomplish. But we might even punt stuff out of V112. But first, when an issue gets filed, there are several folks who have ACLs and rights to this repository in the maintainers list, because there's a Kubernetes maintainers group, and they can assign or add labels as needed. I think one of the most important things is labeling the kind it is, because there's different areas. There's feature, cleanup, a bug, as well as assigning a relative priority and a milestone for some of that. Now, some of those things are ambiguous. Go ahead, Lubomir.
I got a question because I maintain a fairly large project on GitHub and in my personal time. And is it okay to add more kind labels and area labels as well, like vote on them or something?
In order to do that, hey, what's his name's on the call? In order to do that, we'd have to sync with test infra, because they are the keepers of the labels.
Yeah, so you can add them to the label sync tool and they'll be automatically created, and that's doable by PR. But if you actually have write access to the repo, I don't think there's any reason you couldn't just add them that way as well.
We can make them unique for this repo, basically.
If we wanted to, we can make unique labels. The lifecycle label that we added of active, if we want anything meta, then we got to go through test infra to get it synced across repos.
Yeah, if you want it for all the repos, that's the best route. But like having labels created by repos themselves is
fine, of course. And I'm not sure if the tooling is actually ready for this now, but there has been a desire to also have the tooling support labels per repo. I think there's some labels that Kubernetes uses for issue management that we don't necessarily want for Altum that are more related to the like the release lifecycle. I could sync later on where that's at.
That makes sense. So I do think we can add more labels. I do think that would be good. You should have right ACLs, Lubomir. So anybody who's in the kube ADM maintainers list. So if I go to
Yeah, I'm probably going to ask, always ask before adding new labels, of course.
yeah. Here's where it gets a little bit fuzzy for me. I think we should probably have SIG cluster lifecycle maintainers too, in teams that apply across. There's a meta problem that exists with GitHub and hierarchical organizations that is solved in GitLab but doesn't exist in GitHub. So the permissions model is all kinds of weird and funky. It was a little bit more loose in the past, but they've tried to lock it down. So if you don't have label access, just let me know, but we can fix that. You should have write access for Kubernetes maintainers, which I believe you are on the list there. Yeah.
Okay.
So once the issue is inbound, we usually try to assign a relative priority. You can assign an area. I think it's up to you. We don't. No one's really strict about that. It's not consistent, at least. But the one thing we do is if it's ambiguous or if there's a question, one of the things that I think that we do better than other folks is we have this priority awaiting more evidence, right? Because sometimes there might be back and forth. It's an incomplete bug report. We don't have enough information to basically say definitively if this is a bug or not, or if this is actual feature request that they're asking for. And sometimes there can be ping pong. But what I do typically from my side is if there's no response after a period of time and it's pretty ambiguous inside the bug report, I just start to close them out at the end of the cycle because it becomes a maintenance burden to maintain them and leave them open forever. Because what sometimes happens inside of those issues is they become like a Rorschach card. So if somebody Google searches something and they somehow got a hit there, you get this pile-on effect of things that are totally unrelated to the issue, but they kind of hit a couple of keywords and the issue just kind of spirals out of control. So I'm pretty judicious at the end of the cycle. So right now, if anything's at the end of 112 cycle and hasn't been addressed for like 2 weeks from the original reporter, I'm going to close them out at the end of the cycle, just because it's too difficult to maintain. There's enough churn in this repository that I don't want to keep those things open. Now that's how I manage this. What other folks think right there? That's a reasonable approach to apply to all of SIG cluster lifecycle.
That's pretty good. I make sure that I don't close some of those if the label was still present but not valid anymore. But yeah, I agree. We should close them.
I only typically close them if it's dangling. If there is like legit feedback that they have and it's somehow related to a bug, then I reassign the proper labels, right, to those things.
You close out at the end of the cycle, is that right?
What?
You close out the awaiting more evidence at the end of the cycle if there are no updates?
Yeah, if it's been greater than like 2 weeks and they haven't responded back and it's clear that it's kind of a dangling issue of whether or not it's actually a bug or not, then I close them out. Typically, for approvers or leads or chairs, whatever you want to call it, I do try to assign a milestone of when we can address things. If they're a bug, it's usually prioritized to try to get it within the milestone if it's filed at a reasonable time, unless dates prevent us from doing so. If it's a feature, it's debatable. Sometimes we talk about it in the SIG, sometimes we don't. You can take a swag and then adjust accordingly. If folks are part of Heptio, I typically would assign them to certain areas, or I'll ask if other people who are working on something, I'll ask to assign them, right? Like, so part of the prioritization for the beginning of a cycle, what's his name? Lee had said that he wanted to work on testing. So, we assigned him to the testing stuff for the beginning of the cycle, but that just because you're assigned doesn't mean that you're the only person that can work on it. And I think that's the key distinction that I think is kind of unique about some of the work that we do, is that what only makes it, the only time that it's blocking that you're the only person that can work on it is when you mark the life cycle as active, which basically means you have a code that's being worked on, getting ready for a PR for a cycle. And then typically if it's active, I will address those ones to make sure that they get into the cycle too, before I triage the other ones.
We also have a very special usage of help wanted. Like, help wanted was a contradictory label in other areas of the project, but with help wanted, we also imply, like, for instance, I need help from somebody who understands the code better than me. And
yeah, well, that's part of it. Help wanted typically too is someone who's not assigned to issues. I usually use help wanted specifically for no one is tasked with addressing this issue. It's not on anybody's backlog. I don't typically use help wanted as in like, I don't understand this area. I only use help wanted. When I do that, I do CC whatever SIG owns that space. Like, for example, like there's an issue with this core DNS one, right? I would CC SIG networking on the core DNS issue, right? The sizing of core DNS, that was a problem, right? There's a separate PR to address that one, where it's like they defaultly sized it at 170 megabytes. It crash loops on some folks' environments. It's not consistent. So we want to be able to address that. Instead of me having a help wanted label, I would use a CC that SIG, and that SIG's label would then be applied to the issue too as well.
So in that other project that I maintain, we have a label which is in the lines of this is an external bug, like somebody else is going to take care of it. It's not a kubeadm bug. Do we have something like that here?
That's kind of where the SIG labeling kind of occurs, right? So there is, I know there should be one, and if it's not, I'm going to fix it right now. The bug that existed for a long time, cloud provider, right here. It's not necessarily, it's not independent of us. We need to track it because we need to have links in our docs to the proper location for the state of cloud provider documentation. But it's basically on them to get their documentation in order. So using that separate label for the SIG that really is affected, but I still kind of assign myself to that issue and still track it in our repository.
Okay, makes sense. So if we have a SIG label other than lifecycle, it is basically slightly external issue as well.
There's some Venn diagram overlap that exists.
Yes.
Then typically as we get in lockdown mode for the end of the cycle, as a SIG lead, I triage this pretty hard to try and make sure it represents accuracy. So, and we talk about it during the office hours pretty regularly to make sure that if anything's missing, we get it into the milestone. Right now we are starting to enter into lockdown mode. So during next office hours, one of the agenda items is to make sure that everybody's aware what the backlog is and to clear out things that are not, that people can't accomplish within the 112 cycle, and just apply the 113 milestone if they want to, or re-update the labels as needed. It's good to federate this responsibility. This is not what other SIGs do. I've given Lubomir access probably early because he's been doing a bang up job to help me maintain this stuff. And I think having this job federated actually helps everybody, because having a canonical list of state and backlog is super duper helpful for because you never know when somebody's going to come into a project. Like there's a different party that comes in and be like, well, how can I help? What can I do? Right? Being able to have a unified process, or at least a model by which we hold ourselves accountable, helps to bring people into the fold, but also to way of have greater visibility across the project.
We had a session about that exactly with Chuck and Liz, and we moved a lot of issues to the GA milestone actually, and we basically estimated what is realistic for 112, and so yeah, the good thing about that is that anyone can help with this, like make a decision and move it to the next milestone if it's not feasible, or possibly consult with the SIG leads as well if needed.
I think for some things you do need to consult with the SIG leads, like major feature additions as well as like critical bugs. But if it's one of those things where it's like important long term and it's been labeled appropriately, then go to town, right? Like I'm not going to be upset by folks helping me basically mind the fences there. I would gladly help. I would gladly be happy if anyone were to help on that effort.
In terms of features, to sidetrack a little here, do we have any features this cycle? Because I don't think we have any, right?
There are features this cycle. The work that Liz is doing on for certificate rotation is one of them. So there's been a long-standing set of issues that have occurred about people wanting to be able to rotate their certificates asynchronously outside of the upgrade process, as well as the transition to Alpha 3, as well as the control plane join. So those are the three major features of this cycle that I can think of. Those are the big ones. Some of these other kind feature, like there's a bunch of minor stuff that always occurs every cycle. Like, people add options like that root. The chroot option was one that was added. That was a feature, right?
I need to drop to prepare for another meeting, but if anyone else wants to take notes, feel free. I'll see you later.
Thanks for taking notes, Jeff.
Do we have documentation for? Do we want to add documentation for the new config, because it's a requirement to add docs?
No, because it's alpha. So that was the line that we delineated. Was that we will not do formal documentation for alpha things because they churn so much. It becomes a maintenance burden on our side. And one of the things that I wanted to push back on with regards to documentation, especially for code that is in configuration that is in code, especially the type stuff, is that it would be super useful if we did a better Go documentation and leverage Go docs and pointed to that reference than it would be for us to maintain a separate set of documents that is outside of the code that we have to like do separate PRs on for every single cycle.
So I had a discussion about this specifically with the SIG, with the lead of SIG docs, Zach Corlation, I believe, and he mentioned me one of the issues or pull requests I was participating in, and he told me that they don't want to automate this with variables and stuff, like because we changed the version of the config all the time, like from version 1 to version 3 for alpha, and he was telling me that they don't want to automate this version, and I said that we at the same time we want to maintain this in-line documentation only when we go to GA. In the meantime, we still have to embed some of example configs in the docs because people rely on that.
I think linking to GoDoc makes a ton more sense, and having the examples directly embedded in the code, because then it's maintainable, right? From a coding perspective. I think if we were to do it internally or externally, then it becomes a maintenance burden. And we already paid down that debt in 111, and I don't want to pay down that debt again of trying to maintain these separate set of docs, which don't get updated all the time or as part of the release process, right?
Yeah, there was also, I also suggested like we automate the generation of MD files, or basically generate like the output of print default, like the output of this command, we can possibly like embed this automatically on each release. But we don't have the tooling for that, and I don't understand how to do it.
Yeah, I think nearing the end of the cycle, I think we can have a whole separate conversation about documentation structure with how we want to maintain that going forwards. I do think that there isn't good examples that exist inside of Kubernetes that serve as sort of like shining, beacons of what we would like in the future. I do think as we federate more within this SIG, we will run into this problem pretty fast, and we are going to need a unified process for dealing with some of this stuff. And that's exactly what the meta meeting should be about, right? That's kind of part of the reason why I want to have like pushing that to be a meta meeting is that like we're going to need to clear out some of these unified processes to make sure that we have consistency with release artifacts, documentation, and process, right?
Yes. Do you have anything else to talk about the backlog?
I think we've pretty much addressed most of the items. People have questions about like how we deal with grooming the backlog for kubeadm, and if it's like incongruent with how other folks deal with it.
I mean, I think we did a pretty good overview. If anybody has questions, they can ask us, I guess.
Yeah, it's not super process heavy. It's pretty light and kind of slightly ad hoc. We're not like super strict about anything, but we don't have dangling issues in SIG cluster life or in kubeadm repository. So if you look in the upstream repo, there's a bunch of dangling issues, like thousands of them, and that's what I strive to avoid. I think once you get into that state, it's very difficult to find history and to maintain it over time.
Yeah, the search becomes more and more difficult. I had a question. I saw Dim's here, but I think he left. Yeah, I was going to ask Dims about the multi-architecture support and if we're going to do it for 1.12.
There's an open issue, that PR that exists to do that multi-arch support. I thought everything was ready to go, and I CC'd on that issue. Maybe we should follow up there and leave a breadcrumb in this meeting notes.
I think partially we're still blocked on publishing the images with manifests. Previously it was using the manifest tool, but that doesn't support the credential helpers, so we can't push to GCR properly. And you can do it with a Docker command line now, but you need to have experimental features enabled. So there was a bit of a hiccup there, I believe.
That's a little concerning. I don't want to enable all of this stuff by default yet. I know there's PRs and I unblock them. Perhaps we can sync on SIG release with Dims and Ben if you're there too.
Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I can try joining as well. Ben, do you think we can get the testing for PR that fixes the kubeadm runner going soon?
Yeah, let me take another look at that. I think we had just about everything up to date. I just needed to go back over and make sure that we'd gotten all of the kubeadm tests changed.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm doing there, so your help is appreciated. This fixes a number of, hopefully fixes a number of our failing tests right now related to cluster lifecycle.
I'm taking a look right now. Thanks for reminding me.
So what we also did, Tim, what we did with Liz and Chuck, we also went inside every single issue that in the milestone. We started discussing if this is like doable, who is assigned. If we don't have information for this particular issue, we skipped. So it was a nice session to like basically discuss the backlog.
Yes, I think periodically we should be doing that. I kind of do it asynchronously. Like I did it on Friday and Monday. So I went through I did two parts. I went through the entire PR backlog of upstream, as well as I went through my review backlog. I cleared that all out. And then I did a triage pass through 112. And I'm going to do another one next week after the freeze. So perhaps next week, perhaps we could quickly discuss it this week during Kubedium office hours, as well as to discuss some of the other issues that occurred. So.
Yeah, sounds good.
Are there any other group topics that folks would like to bring up? I have a quick question for Ben to see if he's seen any CI signal that we should be aware of. I don't think I did not have time to PR the automation for emails for some of these test failures. And also, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because we get looped into things that we shouldn't be looped into.
Yeah, so I'm not sure at the moment. We had a pretty big problem where we realized we're running pretty much everything in one GCP region and zone for whatever reason, and that zone actually had some stockout issues. So that kind of made a lot of things have a blip in their test failures that was unrelated. That should be fixed now, but it means I haven't followed back up on where everything is since then.
Okay, well, I can sync with it's my job to sync anyways with the CI signal lead. So I will do the release. I will do the release wrangling. Start that now. So Lubomir, if you want to, part of the conversation we had about grooming folks to take over, to be approvers and stuff, this is part of the job.
To talk with the CS signal lead?
Yeah, we're nearing the end of the cycle. And in fact, we should probably start a document with what it means to triage, as well as what it means to be an approver for Kubedium. I know that Lucas started the doc. We have some of these things documented, but we should probably fill out some of the other details.
Do we have an existing document? Can you share the link with me?
Yes, I will point you at the release documentation that Lucas started a while ago.
Okay. I guess I can continue extending the docs there. Something else about the CI signal. We also had this about the job board that Jorge Castro created. We can have an external individual helping us with that. But are you saying that always the SIG leads have to talk with the CI signal lead? Or because I'm not a SIG lead and I've been talking to Mohammed all the time about this?
No, it's just the responsibility at the end of the cycle for the SIG leads to make sure that it's green, right? So once we're getting closer to the release milestones, we need to make sure that everything is green across the board, and that there's a couple other finagly things that only relate to SIG cluster lifecycle and Kubedium in particular that are explicit, like updating the specific version and realizing that certain tests fail, and to make sure not to over index on some of that stuff.
Yeah, Lucas did some work with that with Hippie Hacker. They had educational videos about this. One problem is that I've seen the videos and it's still unclear to me. For instance, should we at this point remove some of the 1.8 tests that we have right now?
I'm okay with it. I think it would be on SLO guarantees from other folks. I think from SIG cluster lifecycle, I think we're fine from a kubeadm maintainer's perspective because it's out of support. So by definition, so that I'm okay with it because we only support 1.9, 1.10, 1.11. And then once we go into 1.12, that will shift again. I'm okay with maintaining the signal for a period of time into the next release and then deprecating.
From test infra's end on that, we've been looking to make this part of the test infra lead role that we have an official point during the cycle where we drop support for a previous cycle. But at least from the side of all the tests that we're running, that hasn't been super clear exactly when that happens in the past. We're trying to actually codify that. I think it's going to be around when we do the branch cut or possibly code slush.
So Ben, is it like a responsibility in testing for to like remove these old tests that are outside of the support?
Yeah, the plan is that as part of the test infra lead who's supposed to be setting up all the infrastructure for the next release cycle, that they should drop off the oldest release cycle.
Yeah, even if the tests are somewhere deep into the SIG structure, I mean, like.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably need to do more to make sure we can identify those properly.
Yeah, probably like a single email, send the email to everybody to, hey, we are removing these tests, and if anybody has concerns, please state them. Because right now I was just wondering if I should do the PRs to remove the 1.8 or testing if we're going to do it.
I mean, we would certainly appreciate you doing PRs to do it, but I even just poking the lead for the cycle and saying, hey, we still have tests that we shouldn't have anymore would be good. Yeah, and we'll have to think more about the owners of the test should be notified. I think they would be at least CC'd on the PR automatically by being by the owners files for the configs now, which is a recent improvement, but we might need to explicitly CC all the owners for that type of PR.
Okay.
Are there any other group topics? I think we've reached the end of agenda. All right, so if there are no more group topics, I think, and no one has said no to the meeting push, we'll push this to a bi-weekly meeting going forwards, and we'll try to talk with the other sub-projects as well to try and loop them into coming to this meeting with a more set of meta topics that sort of cut horizontally across the different sub-projects.
Yeah, possibly discussion topics are going to accumulate over the period of a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and feel free to add agenda items over the course of the week. Everyone should have right access if you are a member of the mailing list. So go forth and add things to the list. I'm sure that, as you mentioned, Lubomir, the testing, documentation, and release artifact structure will be a set of thorns for some time to come.
Yeah, Hippie Hacker made a promise to help with that, but I guess he doesn't have the time. We need a pretty solid documentation of what we change each cycle, because as I've already said, it's still not clear to me what I should change. So yeah, we need the docs, and hopefully we improve this over time.
Okay. Any other last topics? Going once? Twice? 3 times? All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.